visit their fields and see if their crops are growing or if they're not growing very well, and if there's water in the soil or if there's not, and how much water may need to be added. I grew up on a farm, and the farm where I grew up is in California, in a place called the San Joaquin Valley. So it's a real big valley, and there a lot of farmers rely on irrigation too. Like farmers here rely on irrigation for both arid environments. And I grew up in the Catholic Church. I'm Catholic, and that's sort of my bent and maybe my take on things, influenced by that. But water as a gift from God, or whoever you call God to be, is I guess what we're here to think about, praise, and wonder about. And water is a gift given to everybody, not just to me or to you or to one farmer or another. So I'm never great at making speeches, and I'd love for this to be a dialogue. I asked Jen how these things work. I've never been to a UU ceremony. They work however you want.
We're pretty informal, and I know that people aren't shy in asking questions or giving opinions.
Yeah. So any one of us, I'm sure, could go on and on about water, but go ahead.
Well, tell us a little bit about the water situation in the agricultural region of the San Luis Valley, because this is where we live. Even if we aren't directly working in agriculture, we are impacted by the agriculture around us.
Is that kind of where your question is coming from, or did you want to ask something different?
Go ahead. They're good lead-in.
Okay. So Allison had given us an introduction to the water cycle, sort of how water flows through our system. And we live in this place that doesn't get much rain down on the valley floor. And people have decided, myself included, to come live here, of all places. So people had to figure out how to make do when it wasn't raining, and in between the monsoons and the winter. So the earliest settlement, or the earliest people who had passed through here, were native tribes that would have used this as a hunting ground. And this region, tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago, was a big lake, Lake Alamosa. And that lake was fed by the mountains surrounding us, and so all the water that melted off from there flowed into flowed into this big lake. And the lake, it wasn't a valley at the time. There was an earthen dam at the end of the lake, and that earthen dam was down near where today's state line is with New Mexico. So the lake filled up and up and up, and eventually there was an enormous flood that pushed that earthen dam and blew it out, and that's what became the canyon that would be the house Ford. And this big blowout is what eventually formed what the river channel of the Rio Grande would be, filled it down to the sea. So the lake drained, and what was left was an enormous marshy area in this valley, so the San Luis Valley. And that was something unusual to have a live water stream, living water, or rather water during the summertime. So it became a place where bison and elk and other things would congregate. And the people who followed hunting, the tribes would come here as a hunting ground. So eventually the first European settlers, or European influenced settlements, would form, and those were from Espanola and Taos, coming north into the valley and setting up shop or houses and rough ranches in the far south of the valley. And eventually there'd be more white Europeans, not Hispanic Europeans, that would come to the valley. In that mid-1800s time frame is when the first ditches were cut through the valley. So the ditches took water that was melting from the snow, and along with the ditches typically were dams or reservoirs that were built so that all of the water wouldn't be available just in the first 2 or 3 weeks during springtime in a big flood event, but that you could hold more water in the mountains, and then that water would flow into the valley slowly. Because to make a life here in the valley, we figured we'd have to know how to grow food, and the foods that we knew how to grow, or the people who came before us, who were farmers, or became farmers and knew how to grow, were things that wouldn't grow in our incredibly arid environment. So we chose to grow things that weren't from around here. All of that meant we needed to have a way to get water to the ground that we were growing foods on, and that we were growing pasture for animals, livestock, for longer periods into the summertime, which meant we were going to need to irrigate, because it didn't rain frequently enough to have just rain-fed irrigation, or rain-fed crops and pasture growth. For irrigation to happen, that's why these canals were cut, to deliver water to the valley floor so that people would figure out how to make a living on the valley floor and not go hungry. Eventually, people figured out if you dug a hole in the ground, you could get water out that way with wells, and you could potentially pull more water out even than was coming from the mountains, because we have this very large media or reservoir underneath our feet that is our aquifer. And that aquifer is a bunch of layers of sand, silt and clay and gravel and rocks and stuff that allows water to filter in, and it filtered in during the time when this was a lake, and it filtered in during the time when the river ran through the area and flooded. Eventually, we got to the point where there were more farms that had expanded into the places where even not ditches were running, and those farms were having wells that allowed them, through changes in technology of being able to pull water out of the ground with pumps, you could pull more water out than was coming in from the outside of from the mountain's watershed. So that's a little bit about where we're at today, and that we got into a situation where the current status is we pull more water out of the ground than comes in from our surroundings. And we've been doing that as a community for decades now. So that's sort of in a nutshell the quick path to how we got to here. But that doesn't talk about the value of water. It doesn't talk about what water is, or why we need water, or what it's worth. As though when you hear somebody say, "What's water worth?" what comes to mind? Dollars. Life.
Water
What you could
rates.
sell it for, or what it would cost you to purchase the quantity of water?
So some sort of a trade or money rights,
Ownership.
I just got my water bill laying on the counter, and it's like, it's a few dollars, $9, I think, for the water I use. So,
It's worth a lot more than that.
So this idea of worth or value has a lot to do with perspective.
The wars are fought over water.
You say whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting.
Yeah, that's a great Western United States axiom. But what's it really worth?
Our future is.
Well, if we want to see life on this planet, we need to have water. Because water is the basis.
Is it going to go away?
No, but it can be polluted to where it's unusable by various life forms. While it renews itself, there are limited amounts. The water that we've got on this planet now is all the water we're going to have. Minuscule amounts that might come from a meteor or something like that hitting the planet.
So let's go back to the water cycle idea. Just moving movement of water. We're in a dry place, so how do we get water in here anyway? How does it come in? We got those snowflakes hitting boxes and rivers and who knows what else. Rain dances, prayers. So somehow that water comes in, and the water that we use, that we talk about most, is fresh water. So it's not water that's got a lot of salt in it already. And there's not a whole lot of fresh water compared to this blue planet of Earth. There's relatively little fresh water, stuff that's not already commingled with salt water. So 3% or less of all of the water on Earth is in that state of being fresh water. And then less than that is water that's liquid right now. It's not ice. It's not a polar ice cap. So 1% or less. And then of that, we have still a large amount that's in the form of an aquifer. So that's in groundwater. That's water that has potential of doing lots of things or doing nothing at all, and it's water still. We look at how, as cultures, we've valued water, what's water worth, and around the world we can see that water's been put to use in many ways to serve agriculture in the name of food production, in the name of a livelihood, in the name of security for nations. It doesn't always have that finality. That doesn't have to always come to that end. It's often used as propaganda that we need it for this, but it doesn't always mean that. That's what it gives. Of all of the food produced globally, 40% of that food is produced with water used for irrigation. So the food that we consume as a globe, 40% of that is irrigated. It's produced on a landmass of only 10% of all of the cultivated acres. So if you can imagine, of all the food, when 90% of that comes from places that just get rain or just get snow or just get what wells up out of the ground, and 10% of that produces 40% of the rest, it makes it so that people are very eager to use water to make that ground much more productive so that their neighbors don't starve. So we've learned as people to use water in ways that 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, we hadn't figured out yet. And it made it so that we could produce much, much more. It goes back to the distribution question of, well, is it just that those who have the land, those who have the water, have it? Is it just that those who have the food have it and those that don't have it? And is it always the case that it's just because God wanted it so, or whoever wanted it so, that it is so? Or is it that these things were created for all of us together, and we will live or die or perish or continue based on our ability to understand, yes, water is a commons, and it is for us all. We can delegate or we can decide certain people will be stewards and more involved in the use and the funding of that water and the regeneration of that water, more so than the person who has less effort or less time for that. But that's a decision that we actively have to make. Right now, in our midst, we have people who have great control over a phenomenal amount of water, some of whom are farmers, and we have people who have almost no control over the water resource, some of whom also are farmers. And we have people who are members of our society who don't daily think about farms and don't daily think about water, but should have a voice in saying that water is a commons and water is a gift from God. So that's a little bit more about that distribution idea in the Bible.